Thank you for tuning into Literary Blend, a publishing podcast. I'm your host, Demi Michelle Schwartz. There's no perfect recipe for chasing a dream in the publishing industry, but I hope the conversations on this show give you the ingredients you need to bake yours into reality. So let's flip the page and get into this chapter of Literary Blend. Hello, friends. Welcome back to Literary Blend. Today's chapter is called Historical Fiction Corner. And joining me on the show to chat all about historical fiction is Cidney Mayes. Hi, Cidney.
Hi, Demi. Thank you so much for having me today.
You are so welcome. How are you doing?
I'm doing really well. It is a Friday, it is sunny, so I'm excited to get out and enjoy the weekend.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I'm super excited to have you on the show. First of all, congratulations on your publication.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's been a whirlwind, and I'm super excited that it's finally out in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we dive into our chat about historical fiction, I would love for you to share a little about yourself and your journey in publishing and also give the listeners a little sneak peek into Season of Fire.
Yes. Okay. So my name is Cidney Mayes. I am a school librarian as my day job at a middle school library. And I started writing in 2021. So I think a lot of people are like, "Oh, I always knew I wanted to be an author. I always knew I wanted to write books." And that was not always me. Of course, dabbled in like middle school and elementary school with like some creative writing short stories, but those were always for school. But in 2021, I set the goal of I want to write a book and have it published by the time I turn 30. And so I finished my manuscript like a month before my birthday. And since then, I have learned so much about the world of publishing because it is a very unrealistic expectation to think you can write a whole book and then have it published in less than 12 months. Some people might be able to do it, but I think that's not the norm. So, Season of Fire is that book that I first started writing in 2021, and it is now 2025 and just out in the world. So, everything I have learned about writing has been from my wonderful writing community online. And I just started my master's in creative writing program through Southern New Hampshire University. So I'm learning a lot there too.
Fabulous. So can you give a little pitch for Season of Fire?
Yes, so Season of Fire is, I like to describe it as a Bridgerton meets witches romantic fantasy. Um, and it is about a girl named Rose Worthington, and she's very content to manage her family's country estate. She has no men in her life, so she is managing her household. And then a cousin comes to claim his inheritance, and she is forced to go to London to find a husband. However, her burgeoning magic abilities become increasingly harder to hide, and she's scooped up by the enigmatic Lady Nightingale, who invites her to join a secret society of witches um, in exchange for teaching her how to harness her magic and also navigate this very high society in London. So Rose is not only learning about her magic, but uh, gains the attention of two men in her life and is battling with her romance, her magic, and trying to navigate this high society while there are threats of witch hunters newly arrived in London.
So good. Love this. Congratulations again. I'm super excited for
Thank
you.
you.
You are
Thank you so
so
much.
welcome. Absolutely. So let's shift into our chat about historical fiction. So this is a historical fantasy romance. So what inspired you to give this manuscript a historical setting?
Yeah, so as an undergraduate, I studied under a Jane Austen scholar. I myself am not a Jane Austen scholar. It would be sacrilege for me to call myself that. However, my professor, Dr. Misty Kruger, studies Jane Austen, and I took a class with her as an undergraduate and really fell in love with the scholarship around this time period. So, think Pride and Prejudice. And the 2005 version of this movie was my favorite growing up. So I really knew that I wanted to set the story in this time period that I love so much and have studied and have a lot of personal connection to. And then the Bridgerton show from Netflix had just come out. And so I was like, oh, this is perfect timing. I've been wanting to write this story for a while, and I feel like there is a demand for this time period outside of readers of just Regency romance, which is a very popular genre in itself. So I kind of wanted to blend, the historical elements of that time period with the fantasy element and the witches element.
Yeah, it's perfect. And we will chat more about blending those together in a bit. But I just wanted to ask as well, when it comes to authors who maybe haven't written historical fiction before, or maybe they have before and they're trying to determine what time period to set it in, because there are various options. Do you have any advice for authors when it comes to choosing what time period to set a story in?
Yes, I do. I would say choose something that you feel very connected to, either in terms of like your personal history or just your interest level, because you will spend a lot of time researching minute details that you probably didn't think you would be researching. For example, clothing, like how did women dress during this time period? Because that actually plays a role into your scenes.
That's perfect. And perfect you brought up the research because I was literally just going to ask that next. How much research went into this novel?
So I would say a fair bit of research went into it. Luckily for me, I had a lot of materials from my work as an undergraduate and had a lot of textbooks and scholarly articles. So there was, pretty much a whole undergraduate class. The whole class was called Jane Austen in context, and so we talked about the people and the authors that came before her, kind of the political sphere around her time period, and what influenced Jane Austen to write her book. So I did a lot of research into that time period, and then also just looking at historical maps, trying to get a sense of the visuals of the world at the time period, and what would London have looked like? How did were the streets laid out? And just trying to dig for any sort of visual cues that could help me create these wonderful scenes. And also looking at a lot of like the Vanderbilt mansions as well. And those are in Rhode Island, but they are styled in these very opulent kind of Victorian and Regency inspired styles. So just looking for like visuals. And so I would say pick a time period that you feel like you can spend yourself a lot of time in, because you will find yourself just looking up small details for a long time. I think I spent a total of 2 months doing some background research for this book.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. And I think it's really important to research so much because even if every single detail you read doesn't find it into the novel, which is impossible to include everything, I think it's just like with any kind of story. If you are writing a high fantasy story that's a completely different world, or if you're writing a historical fiction novel, you still have the world building aspect to that. And I think that's a very key element for historical fiction because you need to rely on the setting descriptions, the character description, even how they speak and act and stuff like that to really solidify a story in a time period. And so I think the research really goes a long way and helps to set apart stories that just are very vaguely set in a period versus the ones that are so immersed in that period where a reader feels like they're transported back in time.
Yes, I love how you put that about how it just is one element of your world building. Like, in order for you to understand the world and the setting and you to communicate that to your readers, you have to understand the rules, the rituals, the power, the food, all of these things that create these really rich worlds. You said it perfectly.
Yeah, perfect. So before we chat about blending the historical with the fantasy elements, I just have a general question in terms of taking some tweaks and making some changes to maybe some elements that were real in the past because this is fiction. You're not writing nonfiction. So when it comes to portraying a historical setting in fiction, what advice do you have in terms of what absolutely needs to stay exactly how it was and where can authors kind of make some changes to fit their story?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think as long as the changes you're making don't completely break the world that you have created, then I think those kind of micro changes, or maybe they're bigger changes, make sense. I think paying attention to generally the technology that's available at the time, and the timeline of history, and without altering that too much, I think you can get away with pretty much a lot of things. But it would feel very odd if a character was walking into a room in 1813 London and flicked a light switch. So there would be some things where you would definitely want to keep, like, think about those grounding world building um, parameters that you have set for yourself and don't break those too much. However, there, for instance, in Season of Fire, there is an instance where the King of England at this time was slowly degenerating in his mental ability. And so there were rumors, and there's a story that he was talking to trees. And so, wouldn't it be interesting if him talking to trees was the result of something magical that was happening? So just taking, small details and maybe asking yourself what if questions about those details.
I love it.
Yeah.
I love the idea of asking what if, and I also love the idea of realism because even if it's fiction, any genre really, you want the reader to be able to look at a story and be like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. I can totally see that. But like you're saying, you wouldn't have something so crazy where it's like that would never happen in that time period because that would completely pull the reader out of the story. So I like the idea of even if it is fiction and even if you're making small tweaks, you still need to maintain this quality of realism to the point where the reader can look at it and believe what is happening.
Exactly. It's all about, the reader trusting you and you trusting your reader, and to entering into this joint belief and not breaking those rules.
Right, absolutely. So now let's chat about the fantasy and historical blending. This is super interesting. So, how did you approach bringing the fantastical elements into the historical fiction elements while maintaining that realism and making it believable while rooted in that time period?
Yeah, so I think it also just goes back to world building. So I think, you're setting yourself the task of double the back work, or double the uh, preparatory work when you're going in to write something that is historical and rooted in a time period. And then, oh, now we're adding these fantastical elements, and you have to understand, where does magic come from? What are the rules? Who gets to use magic? What does power look like in this world that you are creating? And so it's really a blending of, your world building strategies and how you communicate that to readers in a way that is fun for them to read, fun for you to write, and propels the story forward.
I literally have so much respect for authors who write historical fantasy because I write fantasy and even that is, like, difficult at times to, like, keep it straight. Like, it's so difficult sometimes to create a whole magic system and have all these magical, fantastical elements and create that from my brain, nothing. And then while also in your case, having to keep in mind that you have this almost like preset world building that you need to stick to. So you're combining the totally imagined fantasy elements with something very real. And you almost have like these very two different layers of the world building that need to weave together. So much credit to all of you guys.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's like a puzzle that I really enjoy working with.
Yeah, for sure. So, what do you think your biggest challenge was while creating this story and this world?
Oh, okay. So my biggest challenge for me as a writer is I'm just an overwriter. So when I sent this manuscript to a developmental editor, because I had no clue what I was doing, it was my first time ever sitting down to write a book. I had a wonderful developmental editor who sent me like a 20-page long letter and was like, "Sweet baby sunshine, this is 3 books you have just handed me in a 150,000 word document." So I just tend to overwrite. But for me, my process is I need to write myself into the story and figure out as I go all of these world building elements, and how does the time period affect what characters can and can't do in the story. So if characters are traveling from point A to point B, how are they going to feasibly accomplish that, in a carriage? How many hours or days is that going to take them? Because, transportation is a very real limitation in this world. But we also have magic. So, how can we blend those two things and still keep it believable for the reader? So, for me as an overwriter, I was going into too much detail about the historical elements and little details and things that the reader didn't necessarily need to know for the story. So, for me, going and heavily editing and condensing and making this a standalone one book that could have serious potential. That was the biggest challenge is where is that balance between here's all this historical information and a great fantasy and compelling read.
Yeah, no, I think the idea of including more details than the reader needs is extremely relatable for any genre. That's something that I see a lot with editing manuscripts. There'll be like a couple paragraphs of a very detailed description of like a certain place or certain character. It's like we don't need all these details because I don't necessarily need this to understand the story. You can kind of sprinkle in little things, but there's sometimes so many details that aren't needed for the story, and I understand, like, because I do this too sometimes where I'll include things that aren't needed, that I think it's because, especially when you're writing historical fiction like you are, where you really want the reader to get it, or like me and you, like with the fantasy, where you make this whole thing, and you're like, I think I really need to hit the reader over the head just to make sure they get it. Like, we need to trust the readers more. And it's hard sometimes because you need to kind of walk the line of what's too much, where they feel really overwhelmed, and that can also result in slow pacing, and the other side of this with having too little where it's confusing. And so finding that balance can be difficult. Do you have any tips for that?
Totally. I when I first started writing, I was like, yeah, I'm gonna sit down, I'm gonna write this book and it's gonna be great. And there is a collaborative piece that happens in the background that I think is really important, and that is getting people that you trust and other professionals or other writers to look at your work and offer that feedback. It can feel very vulnerable to share your work with someone, even when you know, hey, this is not done, it's not perfect. But the feedback that I received during this process was so valuable for me, that I highly encourage everyone to just take that leap. Find someone. I connected with so many wonderful people in online communities that were able to even just swap first chapters, or hey, can you look at these 50 pages, I'm really struggling with them. I think putting yourself out there and connecting with other writers is actually a really important piece of what we do.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing to add to that as well, whenever you're in a situation where you're swapping, that's just going to benefit you as well from the other side, because by reading somebody else's work and offering feedback, you will grow as a writer too. And so I completely agree with you. Make those connections, make friends in the writing community, swap manuscripts, and it's just a way to support each other too. I think we can always use more of that support in the industry, so that's a great way to do that.
Yes, absolutely.
Perfect. So I have a couple more questions for you. So aside from the things that you touched on earlier with staying true to the world and all of that, what are some things that you would advise authors to try not to do while writing historical fiction?
I would say don't give yourself um, too many limits and too many barriers in terms of I need to stay completely true to this time period. Really, you are writing a story focused on characters, and these characters have to grow and change over the course of your story. Like, we want our readers to connect with our characters, that's what keeps them turning pages. So even though there are historical details and things that you need to be aware of as you're writing, don't lose sight of creating wonderful characters that are messy and make mistakes, but who readers can really connect with and watch them grow.
Perfect. Love that. So just to wrap up, what are some final thoughts you would like to share about writing historical fiction?
Definitely don't underestimate how much research is required. Even if you just start free writing and make yourself placeholders as you're going, like, oh, I need to look up how long would it take to travel from point A to point B, or did they have electric lights in this time period, or how did people heat their homes? Keep going. Don't underestimate, like, you will want to stop and look up all of these things. So give yourself enough time to do that. But also, you know, do all of those things that help us create engaging characters and engaging stories, and really try your best to blend the two.
Perfect. Well, Sydney, this was such a delight, and this brings us to your plot twist. Are you ready?
Oh, I'm ready.
So, speaking of historical fiction, what is a time period you haven't explored that you would love to in a future story?
Oh my gosh. Okay. I have been really drawn to this notion of, I don't know if you are on TikTok and see the female lady knights, like the women who cosplay as knights in
No,
shining
I'm
armor.
not on TikTok at all.
Okay, so for listeners who do not know, there is a subset of people who like to dress up in like full metal plate armor, and they're these beautiful women, and they're like these knight ladies of TikTok. And I would love to do a gender flipped time period of like Arthurian England and like Joan of Arc, and go full like Chapel Rowan in her full knight armor suit and write a historical fiction piece that is again fantasy, because I love blending historical and fantasy, but I would love like early England, like Arthurian time period with some dragon slaying. I think that would be really cool.
Oh, so fun. Hope you write this someday.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll see.
Perfect. So, can you please share with everybody where they can connect with you online and check out Season of Fire?
Yes, so please feel free to visit me at my website. It's cidneymayes.com. You can also find me on Instagram and Threads and Blue Sky and TikTok at Cidney Mayes.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Demi. I really appreciate it.
You're so welcome. And listeners, that is a wrap on this chat with Cidney, all about historical fiction. If you enjoyed our conversation, please consider leaving Literary Blend a review and giving it 5 stars to help others just like you discover it. Also, if you have friends in publishing you think would enjoy the show, please pass it along to them. Thanks for listening, and until we flip to the next chapter, happy reading and writing.